I'm too sexy for my shirt. Too sexy for my shirt. So sexy it hurts. Oh. Hello, Community Arts Center, Cambria County. You caught me social distancing again. Well, what are you gonna do in these times with this coronavirus? This is the only place I can come and take off my mask. And, well, it reveals that I had to give up my beautiful mustache because of this awful, awful virus. Well, anyway, it does get me out in the sunshine and out in the fields and where farms are. You see, my grandfather was a farmer. That's how I got interested in gardening. Of course, my grandfather farmed wheat like this, and old Bud, when he farmed, he liked a different kind of grass. Well, anyway, it also reminds me of my other hobby, the intersection of art and history. You know, there was another Virginia farmer who farmed in the heartland here, who also farmed wheat and hemp, and he was none other than George Washington.
Why, there's old Splitter Puss. Just look at that mush mouth. This is the iconic Washington we all recognize. This portrait was a study for a larger project painted in 1796 by Gilbert Stuart. Stuart was a classic history portraitist whose job it was to capture the essence of a leader for posterity. Here is the larger work, the Lansdowne portrait, commissioned by British Prime Minister Lord Lansdowne. Old George appears almost regal, surrounded by red velvet and standing sword in hand before a gilded throne. So this was Washington at the end of his career and the last full year of his second term as POTUS, 64 years young, but only 3 years before his doctors bled him to death by draining him of 6 pints of blood to cure a sore throat. Imagine what they'd have done if he'd have overdosed on his Viagra. But I digress. Here's a younger, happier George, before those wooden chompers, painted by Charles Willson Peale. Peale's portrait captures Washington in his 20s during the French and Indian War. He was still handsome enough then to rope himself a wife, Martha Dandridge Custis, a real hottie by 1759 standards. She'd just been widowed and left with an estate of 17,000 acres and 300 human beings in bondage. Although this tripled George's wealth, he was still pinching pennies. Notice here we only see the man from his manhood on up, and how his hand is tucked in his coat. Peale sketched, painted the face, and left the rest of the detail to apprentices. More apprentices meant more money. Hands are difficult to paint and expensive, and this is a relatively small piece, also cutting the price. 6 years later, Washington sat for Peale again, this time as the commander of the Continental Army, for a full-bodied portrait entitled Washington at Princeton, to commemorate his 1777 victory, just south from Exit 9 of the Jersey Turnpike. The state of Pennsylvania took up the tab, and so we get to see the part of Washington that drove colonial ladies wild. His calves. Oh yeah, take a gander, ladies. There were 2 things in the 18th century that put a buzzle in a woman's bustle. One was a good calf. That meant a man rode a horse and didn't walk. He was important. He led an army. Cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Look how proud he is of his gun. But probably the most famous history painting of Washington shows him in a naval maneuver that got him to Princeton in the first place. Washington crossing the Delaware, painted by Emanuel Lutz in 1851. Lutz was born in Germany, but spent his formative years in Philadelphia. He was back in Europe for the revolutions of 1848, and painted the crossing to inspire a democratic revolution in his homeland. This huge depiction of a historical event, more than 12 by 21 feet, is emblematic of a century of history painting. In an age without the interwebs or the boob tube, when only the elite could read, history painting served as a patriotic propaganda, using subject, color, movement, symbols, and transitions to evoke nationalistic emotion. But I mean, look at this nonsense. The actual crossing took place in the dead of night on Christmas, a few miles north of Philly. Used iron-hauling, deep-hulled Durham boats that everyone had to stand in, and Washington took a nap during most of the action and was among the last to cross. Here, Lutz shows Washington leading the charge, standing like a buffoon in a rowboat being bashed by icebergs. Icebergs in the Delaware River, while the midnight sun shines down on his shoulders. I bet you're all humming Yankee Doodle by now. Why he's not holding up a Christmas tree like a saber is beyond me. But look closely to the left of Washington's right knee. Did you ever notice Prince Whipple? He was a real prince from Ghana, whose royal parents sent him to America for an education. An unscrupulous ship captain sold him into slavery, owned at this time by General William Whipple somewhere on the boat, who emancipated him soon after this. So let's give Lutz a little bit of credit here. Overall, Thomas Sully, I think, did a little better with his Passage of the Delaware. No icebergs, no sunshine, but I am curious why he has Hugh Mercer calling for a charge when most of the troops are still in the water and the British are miles away. But it's exciting, isn't it? But for my money, though, this is the best version. Washington crossing the street by comic strip artist Gary Larson. What's that? The other thing that got old Martha all hot and bothered? Oh, yeah, that would be a dad bod. A dad bod in the 18th century meant you didn't miss a meal. That and meaty calves meant you were loaded. But of course, old George wasn't a dad. In spite of this family portrait called The Washington Family, painted by Edward Savage between 1789 and 96, the children here are his step-grandkids. Martha brought 2 kids into their marriage, and after John Parke Custis died of the typhoid with his stepdad at Yorktown, George and Martha took on 2 of his kids, Eleanor Parke Custis, that's Nellie on the right, and little George Washington Parke Custis on the left. George called him Washy. Filthy little urchin. Martha cut his hair short on top so she could wash that little mug and keep on a-going. History's first mullet. George and Martha were childless. Old George had contracted the pox when he was 19, and some theorized that it left the father of our country unable to, father anything else but our country. Back in the corner there was another member of the family, William Lee, or Billy. Billy was Washington's personal assistant, an enslaved man who served with George throughout the Revolution. 3 years later, Billy was the only one of more than 400 slaves owned by the Washingtons immediately freed on George's death. Mount Vernon was a plantation, specializing in wheat and hemp, though Washington called it a farm. In this 19th century engraving, the unknown artist depicts Oni Judge giving water to Harry Washington. Harry escaped from Mount Vernon in 1775 and fought with the British for his freedom for 8 years. He evacuated with the British from New York, farmed in Nova Scotia, moved to London, pioneered the British abolitionist settlement of Sierra Leone, and helped create a democracy in Australia. George Washington used his office to try to get the British to return Harry to Mount Vernon throughout his entire presidency. Washington took Oni Judge with him to Philadelphia as first president of the United States. She stole herself to freedom there and never looked back. This is the advertisement Washington placed in the newspaper, seeking Oni's capture and return. At the same time, Washington was having misgivings about slavery and redrafted his will to free his slaves upon his death, but not those brought into the marriage by Martha, or their descendants, mind you. Martha finally obliged this wish 2 years after George died. One might rather he'd have cleared his conscience the moment he decided slavery was wrong, but old George did the right thing in the end, which, of course, appeals to old Bud.
Well, that's enough of that. Remember, for the rest of this virus, I'm going to give you a piece of advice I usually never give. You can pick your friends, and you can pick your seat, but please don't pick your friend's seat. Not for a while. See you next time, Cambria County. I'm too sexy for my shirt. Too sexy for my shirt. So sexy!